You know this story. A curious girl falls down a rabbit hole into a world of impossible logic, vanishing cats, and a queen obsessed with decapitation. For generations, parents have read Alice in Wonderland to their children as a bedtime story, a harmless flight of fancy from a gentler, more imaginative time. But what if everything you assumed about this book was wrong? Because once you understand what Lewis Carroll was actually encoding into every chapter, every character, every absurd scene, you will never look at this so-called children's classic the same way again. This is not a fairy tale. It is a confession. The story begins on a golden afternoon in July of 1862. Charles Dodgson, a mathematics lecturer at Oxford's Christ Church College, rowed 3 young sisters down the River Thames and improvised a story to keep them entertained. The middle child, 10-year-old Alice Liddell, begged him for something full of nonsense. What Dodgson produced in that boat would become one of the most studied and most misunderstood texts in the English language. But the comfortable origin story conceals an uncomfortable truth. Dodgson was not simply a kindly eccentric spinning tales for children he adored. He was a man living inside one of history's most hypocritical societies, one that celebrated virtue in public while permitting profound cruelty in private. He saw it everywhere. In the factories, in the courtrooms, in the schoolrooms, in the medicine cabinets of perfectly respectable households. And he made a decision that very few men in his position ever made. He decided to tell the truth. He just disguised it brilliantly enough that nobody in power would notice. To understand how deep the encoding goes, start with the most iconic image in the book. Alice, standing before a little bottle labelled "Drink Me." She picks it up and drinks. Her body transforms against her will, shrinking and swelling. Her sense of self stretching and collapsing with every bite and every sip. In the 1960s, the counterculture decided this was about psychedelic drugs, and the image stuck. But that interpretation gets the history exactly backwards. Carroll wasn't encoding a warning about the future. He was documenting the present, and the present in Victorian England was soaked in opiates. By 1865, laudanum, liquid opium dissolved in alcohol, was as common in English households as aspirin is today. You didn't need a prescription. You walked into any chemist shop and bought it off the shelf. Ladies' magazines recommended it for anxiety and sleeplessness. Working class families used it to cope with the grinding misery of industrial poverty. And mothers gave it to their babies. This is the part that is almost impossible to absorb from the distance of the modern world. Infant opiate dosing wasn't considered abuse in Victorian England. It was considered sensible parenting. Commercial syrups marketed specifically for infants, Godfrey's cordial, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, contained morphine and opium in concentrations that would horrify any modern pharmacist. They were sold with cheerful advertising, pictures of rosy-cheeked babies sleeping peacefully, and promises of quiet nights for exhausted mothers. Coroner's records from the period list infant deaths from opiate overdose with a blunt regularity that reveals how normalised it had become. Not as scandals, not as outrages, as routine administrative paperwork. When Alice picks up that little bottle and drinks without knowing what it will do to her. She is enacting something every Victorian child's body knew intimately. The transformation it causes, the terrifying instability of self, not knowing whether you'll suddenly be too large or too small for the world around you, that wasn't fantasy. For thousands of children in Carol's England, it was the biochemical reality of being dosed with opiates before they could speak. Carol pushed the message further in a scene he added specifically for publication. The original story he wrote as a private gift for Alice Liddell did not include the Duchess and her baby. He made a deliberate choice to insert it. When you understand what it represents, that choice becomes extraordinary. In the scene, Alice enters a chaotic kitchen where the Duchess nurses an infant that howls constantly. The Duchess treats the baby with casual indifference, tossing it roughly before handing it to Alice and leaving. As Alice tries to care for it, the baby begins to change. Its face grows peculiar. Its nose spreads into something wider. It grunts instead of crying. By the time she sets it down, it has become a pig. Victorian physicians documenting the effects of chronic infant laudanum use wrote that afflicted babies deteriorated in specific and disturbing ways. Their responsiveness diminished. They became, in the language of one medical report, less like infants and more like something diminished. The transformation of the Duchess's baby was not surreal whimsy. It was a clinical portrait dressed in fairy tale clothing. Carol was showing his readers exactly what socially sanctioned infant drugging produced. He dared them to laugh at it, and then to think about why they had laughed. Now follow the rabbit a little further, because the next great character Carol created carries an equally devastating secret. The phrase "mad as a hatter" existed before Alice in Wonderland. Carol did not invent it. He borrowed it because every person in his England knew exactly what it meant, and he counted on that knowledge to do work he could not do openly. Hat manufacturing in Victorian England relied on a chemical process using mercury nitrate to treat animal fur into felt. Workers called it carroting. It was efficient, it was cheap, and it was slowly destroying everyone involved. Mercury, vapor, is invisible and odorless, but breathed in over months and years, it accumulates in the nervous system in ways that cannot be reversed. The tremors come first, then emotional instability, then hallucinations, then the kind of erratic, frightening behaviour that made co-workers say a man had gone mad as a hatter. The medical establishment understood this connection by the 1830s. Factory owners knew, the government knew, and nothing happened. The mercury process continued in English hat factories for another century. It was not banned until 1941, and even then only because the military needed mercury for weapons manufacturing and redirected it away from the hat trade. The workers' suffering was never the point. New. Carol placed his poisoned hat maker at the centre of an eternal tea party because the image was precise. The hatter cannot leave. He sits perpetually displaced, always moving to the next cup, never at the right seat, never at the right time, trapped in a cycle he did not choose and cannot escape. His famous riddle has no answer because the system that destroys working people was never designed to provide answers. It was designed to keep people sitting at the table, drinking whatever they are given, until they can no longer hold the cup. Trapped. That scene is not charming. It is a memorial. Move further through the story and you arrive at the Queen of Hearts. the most overtly political of Carol's constructions. Her sole mode of governance is the execution order, off with their heads. She issues it constantly, reflexively, for offences ranging from the catastrophic to the trivial. Her court is a theatre of terror in which the only safe behaviour is absolute, unthinking submission. Carol's Victorian readership had a specific and bloody history in mind when they encountered her. The Wars of the Roses consumed England through much of the 15th century, a period in which political allegiance was literally a matter of life and death, and in which the symbol of that allegiance was a flower, the red rose of Lancaster, the white rose of York. Wearing the wrong one in the wrong place could see you executed before nightfall. At Tewkesbury in 1471, Lancastrian soldiers who fled into the abbey seeking sanctuary were dragged out and killed on consecrated ground. The principle of sanctuary, one of the foundational protections of English law, was simply ignored by those with sufficient power to ignore it. Carol's gardeners painting white roses red are not engaged in whimsy. They are depicting the desperate scramble of ordinary people to display the correct political identity when the powerful suddenly decide that yesterday's correct identity is today's grounds for execution. The roses don't matter. The Queen's preference follows no logic. That is precisely the point. When authority is arbitrary, the only rational response is constant, anxious compliance, and even that may not save you. Carol's critique cut even deeper when it reached the institution Victorian society held most sacred, the education of children. Education in the 1860s in England was almost entirely a matter of memorization. You learned verses and recited them. You learned dates and repeated them. You learned multiplication tables, grammar rules, and moral precepts, and you demonstrated your learning by reproducing them perfectly on demand. Understanding was not the goal, compliance was. A well-educated child was a child who could be prompted and would respond correctly, automatically, without hesitation. Carol watched this system and understood what it was producing. And so he sent Alice into Wonderland with a head full of memorized facts and watched every single one of them betray her. When she tries to recite her multiplication tables to reassure herself she still knows who she is, they come out wrong. When she recalls a moral poem, it twists into something grotesque. Every tool her education has given her fails, because Wonderland operates according to actual logic, and actual logic is precisely what her education never taught her. Carol buried something remarkable in Alice's mathematical failures. When she produces obviously wrong answers, 4 times 5 is 12, 4 times 6 is 13. The numbers are actually correct if you calculate them in alternative number bases rather than the conventional base 10 system. This is an extremely specific mathematical joke aimed at colleagues debating the foundations of arithmetic. He was not depicting Alice getting her sums wrong. He was depicting an education system so rigid it could not recognise a correct answer expressed in unconventional terms. Alice's famous cry, "Who in the world am I?" is not charming philosophical whimsy. It is a psychological crisis produced by a specific failure. She has been taught that she is her facts, that her identity is her correct answers. When the correct answers stop working, she has no self left to stand on. All of these threads come together in the book's climax, the trial. Everything about it is wrong, and the wrongness is not random. The charge is never clearly stated. The evidence is irrelevant. The Queen has determined the verdict before proceedings begin. The witnesses are called not to establish facts, but to perform the theatre of due process. When Alice points out the absurdities, she is immediately silenced, because in this courtroom, the appearance of order is everything, and actual justice is completely beside the point. Carroll did not build this scene from imagination. He built it from observation. The Victorian legal system operated on a class gradient so steep it barely qualified as a single system. The same offence prosecuted in the same courthouse could produce radically different outcomes depending on the social position of the defendant. Petty theft by the poor was punished with sentences of hard labour that frequently constituted death sentences given prison conditions. Violence and fraud perpetrated by those with property and status reliably produced a warning and a handshake. Carroll watched this happen, and he concluded that the trial of the Knave of Hearts was not a fantasy, it was a transcript. When Alice finally rises and declares that the court is nothing but a pack of cards, she is doing something Carroll could not do. She is naming the system for what it is, not justice, not civilization, cards. Thin paper painted to look substantial, arranged in patterns that produce the appearance of hierarchy. No more real than a house of cards, no more worthy of the terror they have spent the whole story generating. The cards collapse. The dream ends. Alice wakes up. But Carroll knew that Alice waking up doesn't change anything. The hat factories are still running. The laudanum is still on the shelf. The courts are still weighing the price of a loaf of bread against the cost of a morning's champagne. Alice wakes from Wonderland and goes home to Victorian England. And Victorian England is still there. What Carroll understood was that the most dangerous truths are the ones that cannot be said directly. Power protects itself not only through force, but through the management of what can be spoken, what can be named, what can be acknowledged as a due. Victorian society had refined over centuries the art of making its cruelties invisible, or better yet, making them look like natural outcomes, the inevitable consequences of the natural order of things. Carroll found the gap in that armour. The gap was children's literature. A story for children could be nonsensical. It didn't need to mean anything specific. Nobody would look too closely, because it was just a bit of whimsy, just something to entertain the little ones, nothing to trouble serious minds about. He walked through that gap and said, everything. The Cheshire Cat grins as he disappears, because cynicism outlasts everything else in a system like this. The Mad Hatter cannot leave the party, because men like him had no means of leaving the factory. The Queen never stops threatening, because power that rules by fear never voluntarily disarms itself. And Alice, shrinking and growing, and trying to remember who she is, moves through a world that keeps changing the rules, because she was never told the actual rules, and the actual rules were not the kind that anyone in authority wanted her to know. Alice in Wonderland endures not simply because it is charming or clever. It endures because Carroll was telling the truth. Arbitrary authority, dressed in the costume of legitimate order. Systemic indifference to the suffering of people who build the civilization. An education designed to produce compliance rather than understanding. A justice system that weighs evidence against social position. These are not Victorian problems wearing Victorian clothes. They are perennial problems that Carroll described with devastating precision because he hid them in a dream. The next time someone tells you Alice in Wonderland is just a charming fantasy for children, ask them about the baby that turns into a pig. Ask them why the Hatter can never leave the table. Ask them what happens when you finally stand up in the middle of the madness and say what you actually see. And then ask yourself whether Alice ever really woke up at all.